Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. SLMSSENY would like to welcome you to the School Library Effect in New York State Public Schools Research Update. SLMSSENY is a regional affiliate of SLMSSENY, serving school media specialists from Dutchess, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Sullivan, Ulster, and Westchester counties. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a few tips. There is a live chat available on your screen. We encourage you to post your questions and thoughts throughout the presentation. For our audience members who are practitioners, teachers, or administrators in New York State, this webinar is approved for CTLE hours by the New York State Department of Education. If you did not ask for a CTLE ticket when you registered, please be sure to do that before the evening is over. Digital certificates will be emailed to the email address you provided. Processing of certificates takes a great deal of time, so please be patient with us. There will be a number of questions posed to attendees during this webinar. Please use the chat area to answer these questions. We would appreciate if everyone responded to each question, as feedback is important. For those registered for CTLE hours, if you do not answer the questions and include the time answered, we cannot award the CTLE hours. This is the only way to ensure that you are attending the event and participating. All participants will also receive a link to the recorded webinar via email as soon as it is available. Finally, this is a new webinar platform for SLMSSENY, so please forgive us in advance for any technical malfunctions that are likely to occur. Joining us this evening is a group of educational researchers from the University at Albany, State University of New York. This longitudinal research project has been made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS grants RE 0415008115 and RE 9618003218, seeking stronger evidence of school library effects on student outcomes. We're joined this evening by Dr. Joette Stefl-Mabry, professor and faculty member in CEHC, as well as an affiliated professor in the School of Education and the director of the Information Science School Library Program at the University at Albany. Dr. Stefl-Mabry's area of research is educational assessment and evaluation. Dr. Stefl-Mabry is also a program evaluator for K-12 through higher education and other educational entities. Dr. Michael Radlick is the president and CEO of Learning Technology Visions, LLC in Albany, providing research and evaluation consulting services under contract to schools and other public sector organizations. He is a seasoned educational consultant and former director of planning, evaluation, and technology for the New York State Education Department. Radlick is an educational researcher and program evaluator with decades of successful state, national, and international level experience working with schools, libraries, universities, public agencies, and other public sector organizations on assessment and evaluation of teaching and learning programs. Shannon Mersand is a full-time lecturer and assistant director of the Information Science School Library Program in CEHC. She is a doctoral candidate in the UAlbany in the Information Science PhD program and is investigating makerspaces and their perceived effects on users. Mersand previously worked as a school media specialist in various high schools throughout New York State. Billie Gallo is enrolled in the University at Albany, State University of New York, in Information Science School Library Program. Prior to joining the research team, Gallo worked for nearly a decade in corporate communications at utilities throughout the Hudson Valley. Without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Stefl-Mabry.
Good evening. We will be covering a lot of material over the next 45 minutes, and the last 15 minutes will be for questions and answers. I appreciate that you turned out to be with us this evening. There are 4 parts to our webinar tonight. First, we will provide a brief overview of our research design and data. Second, we will review our analysis of school librarian data across 7 years, spanning 2011-12 through 2017-18. Third, we will review the results of a study that we presented at the American Educational Research Association conference held in Toronto, Canada this past April. And finally, we will provide time for you to share your questions and thoughts with us. We want to start with a very quick introduction to our research design and the data that we have been examining. This will be done in two parts. First, discussing our data sources and analysis methodology, issues and limitations, and second, discussing the specific school library and school demographic variables we use. So the data sources and analysis methodology. The New York State Education Department collects a large amount of school building and district level data on an annual basis via the BEDS, the Education Department's Basic Educational Data System annual census of all New York State schools. The data includes general building, demographic, and program data, including school data about school librarians, including staffing, resources, schedules, program activities, and professional development activities. The BEDS School Year Survey is conducted each October. It's the responsibility of each building principal to complete the form, working together with his or her staff members who represent each area targeted in the survey, including school librarians and school libraries. Each year, as part of its school report card, the New York State Education Department publicly makes prior school year data available to researchers, including statewide building and district level enrollment, demographic, attendance, suspensions, and assessment data. These data are part of the statewide accountability and assessment program. These data sources have provided us the ability to build a 7-year longitudinal database. We are using this database for the research presented in this webinar. The data reflect building level data covering school years from 2011-12 through 2017-18. Data provided to us from the New York State Education Department in electronic format were linked at the building level based on the 12-digit unique school identifier, the BEDS code, to create a building level structured data set. There are issues and limitations associated with all data. These data are the official data of record used by New York State and are supported by a process that has been in place for decades. BEDS data reflect the responses of individuals in school buildings and may suffer from a range of possible shortcomings, including incomplete, missing, or inaccurate responses due to input errors, lack of knowledge, lack of attention, or deliberate intention to inflate the status of their building or program by misreporting on one or more BEDS questions. Our analysis report excludes all charter schools in the state and also excludes the 1,400 schools representing the New York City School District. New York City schools are intentionally excluded for two reasons. First, during the 2012-13 and 2013-14 school years, New York City did not report school library data on the BEDS survey. The second reason is because there are significant differences between the New York City schools and schools across the rest of the state, or what we refer to as ROS, or rest of state schools. The New York State Education Department also generally analyzes data separately and distinctly as two groups, New York City and rest of state. In addition, because of the significant differences in charter school programs and operations, all rest of state charter schools are also excluded from these analyses. Due to school closures and other changes each year, data for some years for a building may show up as missing due to these changes. We created 4 variables that reflect the level of staffing of certified school librarians in the school building. Variable 1 indicates if there is any certified school librarian assigned to a building, either part-time or full-time, during a particular year. Variable 2 indicates if there is less one full-time certified school librarian assigned to the building during a particular year. Variable 3 indicates the number of years that any certified school librarian was assigned to the building, either part-time or full-time. Variable 4 indicates the number of years that at least one full-time certified school librarian was assigned to the school. Here are the demographic variables we used in our analysis. need resource level of the district, grade level of the building, school locale code from the National Center of Educational Statistics. There are 2,848 public school buildings, excluding charter schools, in New York State outside of the New York City School District. These school buildings reflect what are called the rest of state grouping of schools and are the focus of this first analysis, which examines school library presence in the form of certified library media specialists, LMSs, or certified state school librarians. The two terms are interchangeable. This analysis examines two descriptive research questions about school librarian presence in all rest of state schools across 7 years. First, what is the pattern in having at least a part-time certified library media specialist school librarian? Second, what is the pattern in having at least a full-time certified library media specialist school librarian? These research questions are important to understand the relationship between different patterns of school librarian presence and school outcomes. However, before answering the research questions about the effect of school librarians on outcomes, which is something we will do in the second part of this presentation, Dr. Michael Radlick will highlight the pattern of school librarians in New York State schools.
For each of our two research questions, there were 4 breakdown analyses we examined in terms of the pattern of the number of years with any school librarian. The first breakdowns for the pattern is by number of years having any certified school librarian, that is, having at least a part-time school librarian, and addresses what is the overall statewide rest of state pattern, what is the pattern based on need resource, what is the pattern based on grade level configuration of buildings, and fourthly, what is the pattern based on the type of locale for school, urban, suburban, rural. For each of our 2 research questions, the 3 pie charts show the overall statewide percentages first on the left, and then the breakdown percentages for not high need resource, and then on the rightmost for high need resource. As you can see, 73.56% of all 2,848 rest of school public schools statewide had some level of a school library media specialist, school librarian for all 7 years from 2011-12 through 2017-18. 5.83% of all buildings had no library media specialists during any of the 7 years. 79% of the 1,971 not high need resource buildings, that is, those that were categorized as low need or average need schools, had any library media specialists for all 7 years. 4.92% of the 1,971 not high need had no or 0 years of any LMS across the 7 years. And finally, only 61.35% of the 877 high-need resource buildings had any library media specialist for all 7 years, while 7.8% of the 877 high-need had 0 or no years of any library media specialist. This suggests an inverse relationship between having a school librarian and the need resource measure, with poorer school districts having fewer school library media specialists. How you categorize a building based on grade level will result in different numbers of schools in any category. This table illustrates the large number of school buildings across the rest of state schools based on the categorization scheme that we used of pre-K through grade 6 being categorized as elementary, 7 through 8 as middle school, and 9 through 12 as high school. As you can see, elementary only, no high school, no middle school, and elementary school, there were 1,532 school buildings. These are schools that may have had pre-K through grade 6 students, but could include other different configurations of those grade PK through grade 6 students, such as pre-K through grade 2, or grades 1 through 6, or grades 3 through 6. There were 52 middle school only, no high school, middle school, no elementary school buildings. That is, buildings only having students in grades 7 and 8 according to our classification scheme. There were also 6 anomalous buildings with both high school and elementary students, but with no middle school students. The middle school category as defined here only includes grades 7 and 8. However, some school buildings have different configurations. School building level categorization is a messy area for analysis because buildings can be categorized so many different ways. However, it's important to identify building level categories in our analyses as we seek to determine the effect of the school librarian. This set of pie charts show the breakdown by grade configuration. The lowest percentage of schools with 7 years of any library media specialist school librarian is 66.38% in the 1,532 elementary only buildings, shown in the upper left pie diagram. This is not at all surprising, since there is no mandate for a library media specialist at the elementary level in New York State. There is a mandate, depending on the number of students, for the middle school and high school levels, which explains why we see the highest percentage of 7 years of any library media specialist for the middle school only, 90.38%, and the high school only, 89.66% of those buildings. 79.3% of middle schools and elementary, no high school, middle school, elementary, and 74% of high school and middle school had 7 years with any library media specialist. 75.47% of buildings with K through 12, that is high school, middle school, and elementary school configuration, had 7 years with any library media specialist. This chart uses the 4 major National Center for Educational Statistics locale classifications and depicts the percentage of schools having any library media specialist school librarian across the 7 years for each locale. The city locale is in the upper left, starting in the upper left. The highest percentage of buildings having all 7 years of any library media specialist was 79.12% in the suburban category, the lower left pie diagram. Town schools followed with 70.74% having all 7 years of any library media specialist, while city schools had 68.4%, rural schools had 65.3% of buildings with all 7 years of any library media specialist. The percentage of schools with no library media specialist over the 7 years was fairly similar across the 4 groups, with suburban schools at 6.06, city schools at 5.58, towns category at 6.82, and the rural, the lowest, at 4.99%.
Good evening. This is Billie Gallo, and it's time for CTLE Hours check-in. Please answer the question on the screen in the chat area. How would you describe your school based on the grouping we use? Please answer NA if you are not currently working in a pre-K through 12 school. Please also indicate all that apply. If you have a question you would like to ask the presenters or an observation you would like to share, please feel free to post in the chat area at any time during this presentation. While you answer the question in the chat area, Shannon Mersand will move on to discuss the second major research question, which focuses on full-time certified school librarians and library media specialists.
The second major research question focused on full-time certified school librarians and library media specialists. Similar to the last breakdown, we looked at 4 different breakdowns in terms of the pattern of the number of years of the school librarian. Specifically, we looked at patterns for the overall statewide rest of state. We also looked at patterns based on needs resource, the grade level configurations we shared, and the locale for schools, including urban, suburban, town, and rural. 50.53% of all 2,848 rest of state public schools had at least one full-time certified library media specialist for all 7 years from 2011-12 to 2017-18. 17.63% of all buildings did not have a full-time certified school librarian during any of the 7 years. When compared with results from any library media specialists, we can conclude that 23.03% of buildings had a part-time school media specialist during the 7 years. While 56.67% of the not high needs resource buildings had a full-time library media specialist for all 7 years, only 36.72% of the high needs resource buildings had a full-time library media specialist for all 7 years. Likewise, 13.29% of the not high needs resource buildings had 0 years of full-time library media specialists across the 7 years, while 27.37% of the high needs research buildings had 0 years of a full-time library media specialist across all 7 years. This suggests, again, that a full-time library media specialist is related to fiscal resources. When looking at the percent of full-time school librarians by grade level configurations, we see that only 40.86% of elementary-only buildings had 7 years with a full-time certified library media specialist, and 22.78% of these elementary buildings had no full-time library media specialist across the 7-year period. Middle school only and high school only buildings both had high percentages of schools with 7 years of a full-time library media specialist, with 78.85% for middle school only and 74.25% for high school only. Again, these results are not surprising given that having a certified school library media specialist is not mandated in New York State for the elementary level, while it is mandated for middle and high school. 58.45% of middle school and elementary school buildings and 48.82% of high school and middle school buildings had 7 years of a full-time library media specialist. Finally, 47.8% of schools with a pre-K through 12 configuration had a certified full-time library media specialist for all 7 years. As with having any library media specialist, suburban schools had the highest percentage of buildings with a full-time library media specialist for all 7 years, followed by town buildings at 46.59%, rural buildings at 38.54%, and city buildings at 34.94%. City buildings had the highest percent of buildings, 26.02%, with 0 years with a full-time library media specialist, followed by rural buildings, 20.35%, town buildings, 19.32%, and suburban buildings had the lowest with 14.34%. To give you some general demographics for the rest of state public schools, The largest percentage of buildings, 52.14%, are in the suburban NCES locale code. While high needs resource buildings were fairly evenly spread across the 4 NCES locales, the not high needs resource buildings were predominantly 64.08% in suburban locales. The largest percentage of buildings was elementary only, with 1,532, or 53.85%, of the 2,845 buildings. 20.23% of middle school and elementary school buildings were high needs resource, while only 15.94% of buildings that were in the same configuration and not high needs resource. 60.68% of the 1,484 suburban locale buildings were elementary only. 17.05% of suburban locale buildings were elementary and middle school. 15.3% were high school only. Only 1.82% of suburban buildings had a K-12 configuration. Rural buildings had the lowest percentage, 42.99% of buildings that were elementary only, but the highest percentage of K-12 buildings at 14.02%.
Time for another CTLE Hours check-in. Please answer the question on the screen in the chat area. Did you find anything surprising about what we've shared? If you have a question or would like to ask if you would like to ask the presenters or an observation you would like to share, please feel free to post in the chat area as well. While you respond to the question in the chat area, Dr. Michael Radlick will go on to discuss results from our recent research study presented in April 2019 as an AERA peer-reviewed conference proceeding paper.
In this study we presented in Toronto, I statistically tested Lance and Kachel's causal assertion that the, quote, mere presence of a school librarian positively impacts school achievement using our large New York State data set and within a more rigorous causal framework. Our analysis reflects a research design and statistical analyses that address many of the limitations of prior school library research. As Ioannidis said in 2014, it is crucial that any discipline or area of focus build upon evidence that results from a rigorous process of inquiry and analysis. Our intent was to provide stronger evidence based on more rigorous, replicated analyses across different outcomes and subject areas. It's important to note that at present there is no established theoretical framework articulating how or why school libraries or school librarians affect increased student achievement. As certified teachers, a school librarian understands and directly participates in the school's overall teaching and learning process. However, the specific mechanisms by which a school librarian influences the school's overall student achievement have not been empirically established in the research literature. The argument of school library presence and its linkage with student achievement undoubtedly ignores the variation in what librarians do, programming or other activities, as well as what librarians provide, access to resources. There were 3 research questions I focused on in the analysis. First, does having at least a part-time or any certified school librarian in a school have a positive, statistically significant impact on student academic outcomes? Secondly, does having a full-time or greater certified school librarian in a school building have a positive, statistically significant impact on student academic outcomes? And lastly, does having a full-time or greater certified school librarian for a longer period of time across a 6-year period have a positive, statistically significant impact on student outcomes. In addition to examining 3 levels of school librarian presence, I expanded the focus of academic achievement in this study by using 7 different achievement outcome measures, which we'll see in just a second. They encompass different age groupings and subject areas. The unit of analysis in the study was the school building, which is the level at which school librarians operate. The statistical models control for prior academic achievement as well as school demographics and school climate variables. Data from 2 separate segments of our total statewide public school population of 4,600 schools was analyzed. One segment reflecting schools from the largest district in New York State, the New York City school system, and the other segment reflecting all other districts, or rest of state. The 2 populations were analyzed separately, consistent with prior state education department practices, and driven largely by structural differences between schools and systems, as well as differences in variables between the 2 population groups. Separate models were constructed across the building level data sets for each of 7 different achievement outcomes. To address the non-independence of schools within district clusters, a special statistical technique called robust clustering of standard errors was used for all models based on the district identifier. It's worth noting that only a handful of prior school library studies have controlled for prior achievement, and no other school library study that we've been able to identify has ever addressed this important issue of clustering within district, which, if unaddressed, is likely to inflate significance levels of the statistical coefficients in any model. All models in this analysis are based on the same comprehensive statewide longitudinal school level set of data based on beds and the school report card data collected each year by SED. Data in the analyses reflected a total of 4,433 public schools. Note that the focus was on the 2016-17 school year results, and prior school year school librarian data from school years 2011-12 through 2016-17, a total of 6 years. The prior demographic data presented looked at in the prior discussion looked at school librarians from 2011-12 through 2017-18, but this paper was submitted before that data were available. This diagram provides a graphic overview of the complex study, which encompassed 42 separate statistical models. The graphic shows the 7 outcome variables on the left that are used in the different models, covering elementary, middle, and high school levels of achievement across ELA, math, and science. Also showing are the different demographic, school climate, school library, and matching prior year achievement outcome variables that were used in the total of 42 models. These variables were applied to the 2 different subsets of schools, New York City and rest of state. This first table for research question 1 shows the results, focusing on the effect of at least a part-time school librarian, that is any school librarian, on the 7 academic outcomes for the 2 groups, large urban district, which is New York City, and all other public schools, which is rest of state. The answer for each research question comes in the form of 14 different statistical test results as shown here. The NS in the table reflects not statistically significant and indicates that the library variable, that is the focus of the research question, which in this case is any school librarian, and the specific outcome variable is not statistically significant after controlling for all other variables in the model. This first table shows the result for any school librarian and shows a statistically significant but negative effect on integrated algebra results in the rest of state schools, as depicted with the red box and significance level. Explaining why librarians impact math negatively here but do not impact English reading is challenging, because we would expect to see some more consistent positive pattern of effects on student outcomes, especially ELA. Perhaps the negative result across all the 14 models are only chance occurrences and not a real effect, especially since we would expect to see a stronger pattern that would be consistent across population and variables. This second diagram shows research question 2, which is looking at having a certified or more full-time school librarian in 2016-17. As we can see, shows one positive statistically significant relationship with science grade 4 results, but only in the rest of state schools. Why only grade 4? Why only rest of state and not New York City? Again, there's no consistent pattern of results other than no significant effects of school librarians shown in the models. This is research question 3, examining the relationship of the number of years having a full-time certified school librarian and how that might impact school outcomes. If the presence of a school librarian has a positive effect on student achievement, we would expect that schools that have more years of a full-time certified school librarian would show greater positive effects. This table shows only a single positive effect in New York City, with geometry regions as the outcome. Why geometry and no other area? Why only New York City? You can see that the results raise many more questions than they answer. Without a clear, consistent pattern of effects, we can only say that we have not seen or been able to point to any consistent evidence of school library and librarian effect on academic outcomes, even looking across subject areas, grade levels, and populations, specifically for both New York City and rest of state schools. So this is our challenge. How do we explain this lack of any pattern of effects, along with some negative effects, across many different academic outcomes? What is the real difference related to school librarians that makes a difference? Can we identify and measure it? We may believe that school librarians have a positive effect on student achievement, but what is it that school librarians do that creates that effect? At present, there is no established theoretical framework articulating how or why school libraries affect increases in achievement. However, the specific mechanisms by which a school library or librarian influences the school's overall academic achievement just haven't been established in the research literature. The argument of school librarian presence and its linkage with student achievement undoubtedly ignores variations in what librarians do and what they provide. We have to keep in mind that the school librarian is not the only influence on student outcomes in the building. And finally, as a note, I would just comment that we are now looking beyond academic outcomes at non-academic outcomes, including discipline, suspensions, and attendance, to see whether we might be able to see effects in those areas, although we haven't seen them in academic areas.
Your input as an audience member is critical to help us build an empirical, scientifically based understanding of how school librarians contribute to and influence student outcomes. What are your thoughts on the finding we have just shared here tonight? Is there something that you think we have not examined in our models? As you can see, our models are very complex, and we've separated it out by grade level, by subject area. Should we be examining something different? Should we be examining different outcomes? Are there different school librarian or school library variables that might indicate a difference? We really are seeking your feedback as practitioners. Please post your comments, questions, reactions in the chat window.
We're going to give you a few more minutes to post some questions. We're just going to give a special note of thanks for the moment.
We appreciate the continued support we have received from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the New York State Department of Education, the New York Library Association, New York State School Library System Directors, New York City School Library System Coordinators, School Library Media Specialists of Southeastern New York, and the hundreds of public school librarians who are working with us to provide stronger evidence of the school library effect on student outcomes. We will be sending out another survey sometime early in January, and we do appreciate your participation in helping us figure out what are the contributions that school librarians make within a building.
We're going to gather some thoughts in response to some of the questions you have posted. There seem to be a lot of questions about how schools are getting around the mandates for librarians and not actually putting librarians in schools. So if you'll just give us a few minutes, post the rest of your questions in chat, and we will be right back.
So some of you have asked about whether there are any repercussions from the state as far as a school having or not having a school librarian. The New York State Education Department is not the police. However, the results of the NILA census did indicate which schools did not have school librarians, and there has been a push now, as many of you know, to hire school librarians in schools. That's why this research is so important, that we figure out what is the influence of school librarians on student outcomes. Some of you asked why, if they are mandated at the secondary level, why some schools don't have them, and that could also be because there are numbers associated with how many students in the school building, and that then triggers whether a school librarian is indicated or not for that particular building.
Right. In addition to that, there are other possible explanations. Since the beds survey takes place at a particular point in time, it may be that the school hasn't yet hired a school, if a librarian leaves, they haven't brought somebody on board at the time of the bed survey, so therefore they indicate they don't have a school librarian, because the beds is a snapshot at a point in time. So that is another possible explanation, in addition to just being too small to or be under the mandated size for a librarian as well.
Okay, we apologize that we might be a little disjointed in answering some of the questions. There was a question posed about circulation statistics. I think it was by Brian. We do not have access to circulation statistics for individual libraries, so we're not able to determine whether how many books are circulating in the library has an effect on student achievement.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michael.
One of the questions was someone raising a concern about the reliability of the beds data, and that's a question that has often come up, and it's a reasonable one to ask. any data collection effort is going to be, and as we tried to indicate in our presentation, there are potential limitations depending on who completes the survey in a building, what their intents are. We did cross-validate the state beds results with the NILA survey results, and there was a very, very high correspondence in terms of the staffing levels. We were in the 90%, well over 90% correspondence. But clearly there are some areas where, in some buildings, that may not have accurate information.
Right, and related to the beds, I don't know if you're aware as practitioners, but in the last year they have made some, and I don't know who the they is exactly, but they made some major changes to the beds, actually cutting down that whole question, which had over 20 sub-questions. They cut it down to just 3 questions this year, which is really going to affect our research as well. And that's why the survey that we're going to send out is going to try to replicate some of the questions that have been removed from the beds survey. Some of the issues that you're raising here are important. What does the school librarian actually do in the building? What about the school librarians? What about the support from the administration? And also the questions related to curriculum. So those are really great questions. Keep them coming, because if we do look at different ways that school librarians operate or provide services within a building, you're right, they vary. They vary across buildings.
Terry had brought up a good point a few minutes ago, that she really doesn't understand how having a library media specialist can have a negative effect on math scores. And that was exactly the point we were trying to make by sharing that with you tonight, that the land studies that are so often touted in the school library community as just the mere presence of a school librarian affects student achievement is a dangerous statement to make when we have data that shows that sure, it has an effect. Just the presence of a librarian has an effect, and it's a negative one. The point was to show that there is no consistent pattern of the effect of a school librarian based on the 7 years of data that's been analyzed so far in this study.
Yeah, sort of a flip side of that, though, is, and it is possible to explain it, but if you saw, as we saw, some positive effects in science or math, at least the majority of the literature has argued that the primary impact of the school librarian would be in the area of reading and English language arts. So if you see a positive result in math or science but don't see it in ELA, how do you explain that too? I mean, that's good news or better news, but it's still a little more challenging to explain.
And Mary Ann Liz Simmons poses the question about wondering about data that indicates positive collaboration with classroom teachers. We are seeing a pattern that teachers who accompany their classes to the school library and co-teach with the school librarians, we are seeing a pattern where that is having a positive effect. So that is something that we have seen consistently across when we look at this.
More consistently, right, across some of the years, that variable has shown some effect. It's one of the few, those two, collaboration and accompanying, that are on the BEDS form.
Right, and those questions now are off the BEDS form, so please, spread the word that when our survey is sent out in January, to please take it, because the state is no longer going to be collecting information about collaboration, levels of collaboration, co-teaching. All those questions have been removed.
For those of you who are expressing concerns that you're looking to work as school librarians in the coming years, don't worry. there's definitely been an uptick in schools hiring certified school librarians back. I think Terry Richardson also commented that her school, schools in her area are starting to hire back the librarians. There was a period of 4 or 5 years where school districts did cut school library positions quite drastically in New York State, but that is coming back.
Right, and I think the point, too, about the curriculum that I believe Lindsay Valentine made is really important, and that is if you are teaching and you're providing, because whereas Michael looks at the statistical broad range outcomes and effects, I look at the granular level, and so documenting evidence of your practice is really important to be able to identify what your effect is on student learning. And so we are also going to be looking more closely at a number of schools and trying to, again, identify what patterns, what trends contribute toward the school library effect. The question, why would they remove those questions? That's a good question for you to ask your state representatives. We were surprised.
Yeah, I think New York State was in a very unique position until they did that, because there's been a rich database of information that was available for researchers and being used widely, and other states were very jealous of what New York State had in terms of knowing what was going on, and they were all arguing within their own states to try to collect that data, but state had dropped it for whatever reasons, most of it. So,
well, since it's been such a short time that they've dropped it, and since I don't think the community was aware of it, that's certainly something that I think you should be asking your state representatives about. How do you get that question put back on the BEDS form? The BEDS is still there, so it's just a matter of putting those questions back on. Right. I think.
Perhaps the school, library system directors at BOCES, if you're a member, they may have some additional leverage, at least talking with state ed. In addition, I think both of them are vehicles.
Right, because in particular, the rest of state schools were really good about, providing that information. So, and it was valuable to us as researchers, but valuable for you as well.
Anik had asked, where do the school size numbers come from? What teacher is hired full-time with 1,000 students? That's a really great question, and one we can't answer. It's a state mandate that's been in place for as long as I've been around. There is some movement to mandate elementary librarians in schools. I know that NYSET recently signed on to help lobby for that, but until those changes are made, we don't know what will happen. And then, Alexandra, I know that you're just joining the ISSL program as a student, so you haven't taken any courses yet. You make a great point. Is there a difference between an LMS and a school librarian? And the answer is the term is used interchangeably, but what an administrator expects of their school librarian varies drastically from building to building and district to district.
So are there other questions? Oh, aren't they changing, replacing Common Core tests? Oh, they've called them the next generation tests because of such bad press associated with the Common Core.
Right, and just obviously the outcome measures that we use have limitations. We've been using the state assessment results because they're the only common metric across schools. There clearly might be better measures, but we couldn't get access to those data, and they're not comprehensive across all the schools in the state. So, and that was part of the reason why we expanded the look beyond ELA and math scores and, grades 3 through 8 results into regions and then science. And now we're starting to look at non-academic outcomes to see whether we could see any effect there.
Well, as sad as it is time to say thank you for attending this webinar. For those of you who were seeking CTLE hours, we will be sending your certificates as soon as humanly possible. If you need a CTLE certificate and you did not sign up for one, please be sure to do that before the end of the night so that we can start processing those. If you would like to keep tabs on what we're doing with our research project, you'll see a link to our blog post presented here. You can make comments on that blog, continue this wonderful conversation that you've all been having, and thank you very much for attending tonight. The webinar is now over.